Humanity operates under a fatal mass delusion. We treat physical continuity as an absolute guarantee. We view tomorrow as an unalienable human right. We completely ignore a hyperlethal set of objective data. Within the next 24 hours, exactly 175,000 independent consciousnesses worldwide will be permanently erased. This forced physical shutdown is violently abrupt. Zero preamble, zero biological warning. Watch close how they react. A 30-year-old male is piloting a 2-ton metal construct. Kinetic energy propels this machine forward at 110 kilometers per h-hour. His right-side liquid crystal display suddenly emits photons. A low-priority social network data packet is received. His ocular muscles contract instantly. His retinal focus diverts from the asphalt ahead. Visual detachment from the driving environment lasts exactly 3.4 seconds. During this fatal blind flight, his respiratory system remains utterly stable. His diaphragm maintains a low-frequency expansion of 14 cycles per minute. His phalanges and palmar muscles grip the steering wheel with absolute resting tension. There are zero electrical signals activating his sympathetic nervous system. No cortisol spikes, zero increase in ventricular contraction force. He is manipulating massive, lethal kinetic energy, mere feet away from an oncoming metallic stream of high-speed traffic. Yet his physiological markers perfectly mimic a primate resting in a completely safe predator-free environment. But here is the brutal physical reality. The statistical probability of violent, instantaneous consciousness termination is a constant, ambient threat. Why is the human nervous system hardwired with this suicidal base code? Why does it forcibly suppress the exact mathematical probability of physical annihilation? Under the operational mechanics of Earth's physical environment, every bipedal Homo sapiens faces a daily systemic erasure probability of 1 in 47,000. But to maintain baseline physical movement and caloric intake, the human central nervous system forcefully overwrites this objective data. We neurologically reduce our own probability of sudden death to absolute zero. The actual fatal mechanism lies within the subcortical amygdala. If this fear processing center were not physically suppressed, it would accurately calculate the lethal volatility of all ambient threats. Like the 1 in -11 million probability of a free-falling elevator or the spontaneous rupture of an intracranial aneurysm at any given second. Once this high-frequency, lethal data stream is objectively passed, the adrenal glands and hypothalamus would face instant information overload. They would relentlessly pump toxic concentrations of cortisol and adrenaline into the bloodstream. This chemical overload would cause irreversible physical fibrosis of the cardiac muscle. To prevent this systemic neurological and metabolic collapse, your brain was forcefully programmed through evolutionary physical screening. It runs a hyperfast threat desensitization protocol. And it gets worse. Your ventromedial prefrontal cortex is running an even stealthier background command. It initiates a neurological calculation known as othering. When the prefrontal cortex receives visual or auditory signals of a conspecific's death, it instantly runs a spatial and genetic feature comparison. As long as the deceased does not belong to your absolute core physical cluster, the prefrontal cortex categorizes this biological termination as an external system error. This cold-blooded evolutionary adaptation is ruthlessly efficient. It ensures humans can maintain a baseline heart rate in a physical space littered with lethal variables. A heart rate stable enough to execute high-risk foraging and reproductive mating. Watch close how they react. A female Homo sapiens sits inside a climate-controlled structure at 22 degrees Celsius. Her retinas receive photons reflecting off a device screen. It is a fatality report about a pedestrian whose skull was crushed by a falling tree branch. A physical fragmentation event with an annual occurrence rate of 1 in a million. Her frontal muscles contract instantly. Her ventricular pumping frequency spikes by exactly 8 beats per minute in half a second. Mirror neurons are simulating the physical agony of a shattered cranium, but this lasts for precisely 1.2 seconds. Her visual cortex detects the geographical coordinates of the event are in another city. The neurological suppression signal is deployed immediately. Her pulmonary muscles physically expel exhaust gas. The skeletal muscle tension in her shoulders drops, lowering by exactly 2 centimeters. Her thumb immediately executes a friction slide on the glass screen. Visual input switches to high-saturation carbohydrate imagery. The neurochemical anxiety storm that could have been lethal a moment ago is instantly metabolized and flushed from the system as waste. This forced biological ignorance executed by carbon-based organisms creates an utterly terrifying physical vulnerability. We walk unprotected through a chaotic radar grid of physical variables every single day. We step forward with the absurd neurological arrogance of immortals. This misalignment results in a brutal objective truth. These sudden biological terminations are not just tragedies. They remain absolutely invisible to the host organism right up until the exact millisecond of physical impact. But here is the brutal physical reality. If the forced shutdown of your existence is a mathematical certainty, your brain desperately hides. The true terror behind this mechanism is not how this physical body will eventually decay. It is the terrifying mathematical fragility of how we were even assembled in the first place. Our brains desperately mask the mathematical probability of sudden death, but the physical reality is far more suffocating. The fact that you currently possess this flesh and independent consciousness is an absolute statistical miracle. Your existence is the product of a billion-year genetic tyranny. A single micrometer of deviation during this process, and your specific genetic code would have been permanently erased by the laws of physics. The actual fatal mechanism is meiotic recombination. In the reproductive cycle of every human generation, a male produces trillions of spermatozoa. A female harbors roughly 300,000 ova in her ovaries. Homologous chromosomes undergo extremely violent physical breaking and crossing over during pairing. This blind reshuffling of genetic material is purely random. It generates near-infinite permutations within the cell nucleus. Just in the single genetic fusion of your immediate parents, the physical probability of generating your specific phenotype mathematically plummets exponentially below 1 in 1 quadrillion. And it gets worse. This hyper-fragile cytological probability is ruthlessly tied to ancient, fleeting biological mating windows. Your ancestors did not select mates randomly. This involved a brutally strict set of neurochemical calculations. The brain instantly performs geometric assessments of facial symmetry. It scans pheromone concentrations and systemic social dominance markers. If a single metric triggers a cliff-edge drop in dopamine or oxytocin, the reproductive system forcibly aborts the genetic fusion. Watch close how they react. It is a dimly lit physical space 50,000 years ago. A male Homo sapiens body approaches a female body. 2 sets of eyeballs execute a precise physical lock. This direct docking of retinal light sources lasts exactly 3.5 seconds. The pupillary aperture in the center of the female's eyes dilates by 1.5 millimeters. Olfactory receptors in her nasal cavity capture trace sweat molecules in the air. They frantically pass his specific major histocompatibility complex. A dopaminergic reward electrical signal detonates deep within her brainstem. Her cervical bones microcontract, causing her mandible to physically drop. Her spinal torso angles precisely 15 degrees toward the target. This hyperfragile, microscopic muscular displacement is the absolute prerequisite for your entire future genetic lineage. But here is the brutal physical reality. This billion-year genetic chain was constantly on the verge of snapping. Among the tens of thousands of direct ancestors that construct you, if a single hominid deviated slightly, contracted a minor respiratory virus on a specific Tuesday, shifted their attention for half a second before genetic pairing, or displayed a micro-expression of disgust instead of arousal, Your specific nucleotide sequence would be permanently and irrevocably deleted from the timeline of reality. Yet, this hyper-fragile biological winning streak depends entirely on a physical stage to host it, and the operational mechanics of this stage are deadlocked by an even more claustrophobic set of cosmological parameters. The default factory setting of the universe is not to incubate life. It is statistically optimized for absolute cold and dead emptiness. Carbon-based matter forming within this space relies entirely on the pathological fine-tuning of the gravitational and cosmological constants. The mathematical deductions of theoretical physics reveal a brutal truth. If the expansion rate of the early universe shifted by 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, the space would either violently collapse in on itself in a fraction of a second, or the expansion velocity would become so savage that stellar nuclear fusion could never ignite. The stellar furnaces forging carbon, oxygen, and iron would be permanently sealed. Every fundamental component required for eukaryotic life would be physically zeroed out, and it gets worse. Merely occupying a stellar habitable zone is insufficient to preserve this flesh. Biological continuation demands billions of years of uninterrupted liquid water. This requires the planetary crust to maintain violently active tectonic plate movements. This massive carbon silicate cycle system acts as a ruthless planetary thermostat, forcibly suppressing fatal runaway greenhouse effects and global glaciation. Watch close how they react. A human body stands still on concrete pavement at solar noon. Thermal receptors in the dermal layer capture incoming heat radiation. They instantly fire high-frequency neural impulses to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus immediately bypasses conscious thought and hijacks the somatic system. It commands the body's exocrine glands to squeeze out microdroplets of water and sodium. The ambient air physically evaporates this fluid immediately, violently extracting thermal energy from the flesh, pinning the core temperature dead at 37 degrees Celsius. That microscopic droplet of sweat successfully excreting onto the epidermis. That human standing and executing that complex physiological function is possible only because the gravitational tension of the entire universe exceptionally allowed a specific G-type main sequence star, operating in a vacuum 149 million kilometers away, to sustain continuous nuclear fusion at the exact correct temperature for 4.5 billion years without ever extinguishing. When we elevate our observational scale to this intensely hostile cosmological level, confronting this absolute biological impossibility, the neurological fear of premature death generated by our limited cognition is about to undergo a fundamental collapse at its core logic. Death has an absolute 100% trigger rate simply because you forcibly won a cosmically rigged gamble. The termination of your flesh is not a physical tragedy. Your current physical existence itself is an extreme anomaly in the universal source code. The actual fatal mechanism lies in the brain's temporal discounting algorithm to prioritize immediate survival in a hostile terrestrial environment. Your neural circuits forcefully locked out absolute focus on the future. It engineers a pathological terror regarding the impending stripping of your consciousness, while simultaneously processing the objective fact that you are breathing right now as a mundane physical norm. Your brain frantically mourns the inevitable end of this timeline, yet completely lacks the processing power to compute the physical absurdity of this timeline's beginning. And it gets worse. When humans are forced to process massive data overloads like cosmological scales, the central nervous system triggers a rare electrical signal known as awe. Functional MRI scans reveal the physical truth. This signal physically suppresses the brain's default mode network, the exact neural hub responsible for generating egocentrism and self-referential anxiety. When blood oxygen levels in this region are forcefully reduced, the neuronal terror of physical annihilation is forcibly overwritten by the pure objective observation of physical reality. Watch close how they react. A Homo sapiens body sits on a polyurethane chair in a sterile clinic. Acoustic waves deliver the data of a 6-month survival prognosis into his auditory cortex. The sympathetic nervous system detonates a violent physical response instantly. The contraction frequency of the pulmonary diaphragm doubles within 3 seconds. Peripheral nerves in the phalanges begin an uncontrollable, violent tremor. Blood carbon dioxide levels fluctuate wildly due to hyperventilation. But shift the timeline forward exactly 504 hours. The same biological organism sits on an outdoor wooden bench. His retinas lock onto a single micrometer scale dust particle suspended in a photon beam. For 600 unbroken seconds, the eyeballs register 0 physical deflection. The violent physiological panic signals have completely vanished. Air fills the alveoli in an agonizingly slow, deep physical rhythm. Egocentric survival terror has undergone a physical collapse at the neural level into the pure objective recording of the current space-time. Death is not a physical theft committed against you by the universe. It is merely an unavoidable mathematical bill that must be paid, because that statistically impossible allocation of physical existence has already been forcefully issued and is currently being entirely consumed by you. You are not a victim of time. You are the entire universe, experiencing a brutally brief self-observation, a millisecond flicker that is statistically impossible. Every physical contraction of your diaphragm, every oxygen exchange between your alveoli and bloodstream is a blatant defiance of this cold vacuum and its cosmological constants. Whether your flesh undergoes sudden physical fragmentation tomorrow or experiences total telomere depletion 50 years from now, it is merely the universe executing a microscopic mathematical correction. The baseline physical state of reality is absolute nothingness. You are the lethal system glitch. Since you are a biological anomaly, clearly marked with a physical expiration date, immediately cease optimizing your physiological functions around meaningless absolute safety. Stop hoarding physical time that you do not legally own. Calculate your physical friction objectively. Absolutely, do not divert retinal focus while piloting a 2-ton heavy metal vehicle. Refuse to proactively introduce low-level statistical death variables. The actual fatal mechanism is long-term systemic stasis. You must forcefully execute high-friction, high-yield physical tasks with a cold-blooded, mathematically calculated, absolute urgency. Build the systems, type the code. Start those difficult conversations that easily trigger cortisol spikes. Your nervous system has 0 spare processing power for passive dopamine consumption. If you intend to completely drain the final value of this statistical loophole, you must build structures capable of outlasting your carbon-based decay cycle. Master the underlying architecture, running the background of the modern world. Enter boot.dv. Make your phalanges execute high-frequency physical displacements across a keyboard. Counterkill the algorithmic tyrants currently devouring your attention. Extract and utilize the data interface in the description zone below. The telomeres in your cells are irreversibly shortening. Your physical countdown is nearly exhausted. Subscribe